The air didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, like a shroud made of iron. Silas was 64 years old, a man whose joints sang a symphony of aches every time the wind shifted. His hands, mapped with the scars of 40 years in the fur trade, gripped the lead rope of his pack horse, Bess, with a desperation he hadn't felt since his youth. They were crossing the Blackwood River, a vein of ice that looked solid, but breathed with the treacherous rhythm of moving water beneath. The sun had been gone for weeks, replaced by the polar dark, a bruised purple twilight that never quite became day. Crack. It wasn't a loud sound, it was the delicate snap of a dry twig, yet it echoed like a cannon shot in the frozen silence. Silas froze. He looked back at Bess. The old mare's eyes were wide, reflecting the ghostly shimmer of the aurora borealis dancing overhead. She knew. Before Silas could even draw a breath to calm her, the world simply opened. The ice gave way, not with a crash, but with a sickening liquid slurp. The horse screamed, a sound so raw and human-like it tore through Silas's chest. In an instant, his world vanished. The sled, containing his blankets, his dry meat, his flint and his rifle, was dragged into the black moor of the river by the weight of the animal. "No! Bess, no!" Silas lunged, his boots sliding on the slick surface. He grabbed for the rope, the hemp burning his palms, but the current was a titan. He watched, paralyzed, as the mare's head dipped below the slush. For one heartbeat their eyes met, an old friend asking for help he couldn't give. Then there was only the gurgle of the water and the terrifying hollow sound of ice grinding against ice. Everything was gone. Silas stood alone in the center of the river. The silence returned heavier than before. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking, not from the cold yet, but from the sudden, violent realization of his own mortality. He had no fire. He had no food. He was 300 miles from the nearest outpost, and the temperature was dropping to 40 below. He reached into his heavy wool coat and felt a small, hard shape in his inner pocket. He pulled it out. It was a silver locket, the hinge rusted shut by years of sweat and toil. Inside was the faded image of Martha. He ran his thumb over the metal, his breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to ice crystals on his beard. "I'm not leaving you yet, Martha," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm not dying in the dark." He turned his back on the hole where his life had just vanished and began to walk. Every step was a prayer, every breath was a battle. The polar night had claimed his past, but he would fight like a demon for his future. Before we continue our journey into the wild, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The first mile was the hardest. When a man loses everything, his mind becomes his greatest enemy. Silas could feel the siren song of the cold, that gentle, deceptive urge to simply sit down, close his eyes, and let the numbness take over. His boots, soaked through by the splashing water from the hole, were already beginning to freeze solid. If he didn't find a way to dry them, he would lose his toes by morning. If he didn't find shelter, he wouldn't see the morning at all. He scanned the horizon. In the subarctic, the trees don't grow tall. They are stunted, twisted, drunken forests of black spruce that look like skeletal hands reaching out of the snow. He found a small depression beneath a fallen log, buried deep under a drift. With fingers that felt like wooden pegs, Silas began to dig. He didn't have a shovel, so he used his hands, the frozen crust of the snow tearing at his cuticles. He dug until he reached the frozen earth, creating a snow coffin, a hole just large enough to trap his body heat. As he crawled into the cramped, dark space, the reality hit him. He had no tinder. He had no way to make a spark. He huddled into a ball, pulling his knees to his chest, and felt the crushing weight of the 300 miles ahead. He thought of the heat of a kitchen in autumn, the smell of baking bread, and the way Martha used to squeeze his hand when he returned from a long trip. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on his ribs, trying to squeeze the last of the warmth from his heart. But as he closed his eyes, he didn't see the ice. He saw the flicker of a candle in a window far, far away. "One step," he muttered into the fur of his collar. Just give me the next step. The second day didn't arrive with a sunrise. It arrived as a thinning of the blackness into a bruised metallic grey. Silas crawled out of his snow burrow, his body screaming in protest. His joints felt as though they had been fused together with rusted nails. Every movement was a chore of the will. He stood up, shaking the frost from his wool coat, and looked back toward the river. The tracks of his struggle from the night before were already being erased by the drifting powder. He began to walk, his eyes fixed on the distant, jagged silhouette of the Brooks Range. To stay alive, he had to move. Movement was friction, friction was heat. Heat was life. But as the hours bled into one another in the featureless white void, his mind began to drift. This is the danger of the long trek. When the body starves, the mind feasts on the past. He wasn't in the subarctic anymore. In the shimmering haze of the wind-blown snow, Silas saw the golden wheat fields of the Shenandoah. He could almost smell the sweet, heavy scent of overripe apples and the damp, rich earth of a Virginia autumn. It was 30 years ago. He saw Martha standing by the well, her apron fluttering in a breeze that didn't bite, but caressed. "Silas, come in before the light fades," she called out in his mind, her voice as clear as a bell in a mountain valley. He remembered the weight of a harvest basket in his arms, so different from the weight of this crushing cold. Back then, tired meant the honest ache of a day's work, followed by a warm bed and a bowl of stew. Here, tired was the slow-motion collapse of a biological machine. He stumbled over a hidden rock, falling hard onto his knees. The pain was sharp, but it was the only thing that felt real. He stared at his hands. They were grey, the skin puckered and dry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried strip of leather. It was a piece of the harness he had managed to cut away before the horse went down. He began to chew on it. There was no nutrition in it, only the faint, salty taste of Bess's sweat and the bitter tannins of the cure. It was a phantom meal, a cruel joke played by his stomach. "Focus, Silas," he rasped, his throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. To find water in a world made of ice is a paradox that kills many. He couldn't eat the snow. It would lower his core temperature and hasten the end. He had to find a glacier window, a place where the wind had polished the ice clear enough for the sun's weak rays to create a microscopic layer of moisture, or find a willow soak. He remembered his father, Elias, a man who had survived the year without a summer in 1816. Elias had taught him that nature never gives anything for free. You have to trade for it. "The land is a ledger, son," his father had told him while they sat by a roaring hearth. "You put in the sweat, you get out the grain. But if you try to take without paying, the land will come to collect." Silas realized he was paying now. He was paying for every year he had spent taking furs from this land, every fire he had enjoyed, every meal he had taken for granted. The debt was being called in, and the interest was his very blood. He found a stand of willow near a frozen creek bed. With a trembling knife, he scraped the inner bark, the cambium. It was bitter, stinging his tongue, but it contained salicin, a natural aspirin to dull the fire in his joints. He chewed the bark, the juices staining his teeth, and for a moment the memory of Martha's elderberry wine flashed across his palate. It was so vivid he actually reached out a hand, expecting to touch the rough-hewn wood of their dining table. His hand met only the biting air. The contrast was a physical blow. The warmth of the memory made the present feel 10 times colder. He realized then that the hardest part of the 300 miles wouldn't be the wind or the wolves. It would be the crushing loneliness of a man who had outlived his world. He was a relic of a different era, a ghost walking through a graveyard of ice. As the purple twilight returned, Silas found a small rock overhang. He didn't have the strength to dig another deep burrow. He huddled against the stone, the cold leaching the heat from his spine. He pulled the locket out again. He didn't open it, his fingers were too numb for the delicate latch, but he pressed it against his cheek. "I'm still paying, Father," he whispered into the dark, "but I ain't broke yet." The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that mimicked the cry of a loon. Silas closed his eyes, drifting between the frozen present and the golden past, praying that the ghosts of the harvest would keep him warm for one more night. The third day brought a terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The wind, which had been a screaming banshee for 48 hours, suddenly died. In its place came a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against Silas's eardrums. In the subarctic, silence is rarely a gift, it is a predator's cloak. Silas continued to move, but his gait had changed. He was no longer walking, he was shuffling, his feet barely lifting off the frozen crust of the earth. His world had shrunk to the 5 feet of grey snow directly in front of his face. His eyes were bloodshot, the eyelids heavy with ice fringe, the frozen condensation of his own lashes that threatened to knit his eyes shut every time he blinked. Then he felt it. That prickle on the back of the neck that tells a man he's no longer the only living thing in the wasteland. He stopped. He didn't turn his head. That would take too much energy. He waited. At first, there was nothing but the sound of his own heart, a slow, thudding drum inside a hollow chest. Then a soft scuff, the sound of a paw breaking the surface of the snow. A lone grey wolf, its coat the color of a winter storm, emerged from the haze about 50 yards behind him. It wasn't the snarling beast of campfire legends. It was thin, its ribs showing through the matted fur, and its eyes held a terrifying intelligence. It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. It was a witness to his slow decline, a patient accountant waiting for Silas to trip one last time. "Not today, brother," Silas croaked. His voice sounded like breaking glass in the stillness. The isolation began to warp his mind. The wolf became more than an animal. It became a symbol of his own shadow, a manifestation of the death he had been outrunning since the river took Bess. He started talking to it. He told the wolf about the time he built the barn back in 72, how the smell of fresh cedar had filled the air. He told the wolf about his son, Thaddeus, who had left for the goldfields and never sent a letter back. "You have a son, Wolf?" Silas asked, his mind fracturing. "Do they leave you too when the winter gets long?" The psychological pressure of the polar dark is a heavy burden for a young man. For a man of Silas's years, it was a crushing debt. Without the sun to mark the passage of time, hours felt like days. He began to see things in the periphery of his vision, flickering shadows that looked like the silhouettes of old friends, or the ghost of his packhorse, trailing him with a sled full of warm blankets that didn't exist. He reached a stretch of anvil ice, flats so hard and slick that even the wind couldn't find a grip. Here, findable water was a myth. To survive, Silas had to use a technique he'd learned from the indigenous hunters decades ago. He found a small patch of dark rock that had absorbed what little ambient light the purple sky offered. He scraped the frost from the stone and pressed his dry, cracked tongue against the cold mineral. The moisture was microscopic, but it kept his throat from seizing. The wolf drew closer, now only 20 yards away. It sat on its haunches, watching Silas struggle to stand after his meager drink. The isolation was a poison. Silas felt a sudden violent urge to scream, to run into the blackness until his heart burst, just to end the agonizing stillness. He felt forgotten by God and man. Who would know if he fell here? The snow would cover him in minutes. The wolf would leave nothing but splinters of bone. In the grand ledger of the frontier, he was a rounding error, a name that would be erased by the next blizzard. He reached for the locket again, but his fingers were so swollen and frostbitten they felt like sausages. He couldn't feel the metal. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. If he lost the feeling in his hands, he lost his connection to Martha. He lost the only thing keeping him from letting the wolf win. "I am Silas Thorne," he whispered, forcing the words out through blue lips. "I was born in the spring. I have carried the plow. I have buried my dead. I am still here." He picked up a jagged piece of frozen wood, a branch of ancient, petrified larch. He didn't have a rifle, but he had the reach of a man who refused to be prey. He turned to face the wolf, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light that seemed to startle the beast. The wolf tilted its head, its golden eyes reflecting the old man's defiance. It didn't retreat, but it didn't advance. They stood there, two ghosts in a dead world, bound by the hunger and the dark. Silas took a step forward, then another. He wasn't walking toward the outpost anymore. He was walking through the very idea of death. The 300 miles were no longer a distance. They were a test of how much a soul could endure before it turned to ice. The sixth day was a hallucination of pain. The temperature had plummeted into a realm where breath didn't just turn to mist. It turned to needles that punctured the lungs. Silas's legs were no longer parts of his body. They were heavy, frozen pillars that he had to swing forward by the sheer force of his shoulders. He had reached the devil's throat, a narrow canyon where the wind was funneled into a relentless, screaming gale. Here, the snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, sharp as shards of glass, stripping the skin from any exposed surface. Silas's goggles had been lost miles ago, and his eyes were nearly swollen shut, caked in a thick crust of frozen brine. He was dying. He knew the signs. The cold sleep was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. His heart was skipping beats, a faltering engine running on the last drops of a bitter fuel. Then he saw it, or he thought he did. A light. Not the shimmering, taunting green of the aurora, but a steady orange pulse. A fire. It was nestled in a small cave halfway up the canyon wall. With a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper in his mouth, Silas began to climb. He crawled on his hands and knees, his fingernails snapping off against the frozen rock, leaving a trail of dark, frozen rubies in the snow. But as he reached the ledge, the light vanished. There was no fire. There was no cave. There was only a hollow in the stone and the cruel, mocking wind. Silas collapsed. He lay on his back, staring up at the eternal purple void. The wolf, the silent shadow that had followed him for 100 miles, was standing at the edge of the ledge. It didn't look like a predator anymore. It looked like a grim reaper in fur, waiting for the final breath to leave the body. "I can't," Silas whispered. The words were barely a vibration in his throat. "Martha, I'm so tired." He reached into his coat to touch the locket one last time, but his hand wouldn't move. His arm was pinned beneath his own weight, and he didn't have the strength to roll over. The silence of the canyon began to hum, a low, vibrating frequency that signaled the end of the nervous system's fight. This was the moment of the great trade. To stay here was to die. To move was to suffer beyond human comprehension. With a scream that was more a guttural animal howl than a human cry, Silas forced his body to move. He didn't use his muscles. He used his rage. Rage at the river that took his horse. Rage at the god who let his wife die in a sickbed while he was away. Rage at the very ice that thought it could claim a man of the frontier. He rolled onto his stomach and began to drag himself forward. He wasn't walking. He was a worm in the snow. He used his elbows to hook into the ice, pulling his dead weight inch by agonizing inch. The wolf followed, its nose inches from Silas's frozen boots. Suddenly a sound broke through the wind. A bell, a low, rhythmic clang, clang, clang. It was the signal bell from the Fort Providence outpost, rung during storms to guide lost souls home. It was close, less than a mile, but it might as well have been on the moon. Silas reached a small, frozen pond, the last obstacle before the fort's gates. The ice was thin here, warmed by a thermal spring beneath. He felt it crack. Not again. He didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He threw his body forward, spreading his weight. The ice groaned and shattered, plunging his lower half into the slush. The shock was so violent his heart nearly stopped. But Silas didn't cry out. He grabbed a protruding willow root on the far bank and hauled himself out with a strength born of pure, unadulterated madness. He lay on the far bank, gasping, his clothes turning into a suit of armor as the water froze instantly. He looked back. The wolf stood on the other side of the broken ice. It looked at him, let out a single low whine, and turned back into the darkness. Its job was done. Silas looked toward the sound of the bell. Through the swirling white, he saw the silhouette of a timber wall and the warm, golden glow of real lanterns. He tried to stand, but his legs failed. He tried to call out, but his voice was gone. He took the locket from his pocket, his fingers miraculously finding the strength for one last act, and held it high into the air. The silver caught the light of a distant lantern. "Man down!" a voice shouted from the ramparts. "Someone's at the gate!" Silas fell forward into the snow, the locket still clutched in his hand. He had walked 300 miles through the mouth of hell. He had lost his horse, his supplies, and very nearly his mind. But as the heavy timber gates creaked open and warm hands reached out to pull him from the dark, Silas Thorne knew one thing: the ledger was settled. He was going home. The world returned to Silas in fragments of heat and sound, the crackle of seasoned pine in a hearth, the smell of medicinal lard and boiled spruce needles, the low rhythmic murmur of men's voices, hushed as if they were standing in a cathedral. When he finally opened his eyes, he wasn't in the Virginia fields of his dreams. He was in the infirmary of Fort Providence, a room built of rough-hewn logs that wept sap in the heat of the central stove. Silas tried to move his hand, but it was a heavy, bandaged club. He looked down and saw his feet propped up, wrapped in thick layers of oil-soaked linen. The pain arrived then, not the sharp, biting cold of the trail, but a deep, throbbing heat, like his blood had been replaced with molten lead. It was the pain of a body coming back from the brink, a violent reclamation of life. "Easy now, Silas," a voice said. It was Thaddeus, the forts factor, a man whose face was a map of 50 years of northern winters. He leaned over, placing a steadying hand on Silas's shoulder. "You've been under for 2 days. Most men would have stayed under." Silas worked his jaw, his lips cracking. "The locket?" Thaddeus nodded and reached for a small wooden table. He held up the silver locket. It had been cleaned of the frozen blood and salt, but the metal was dented where Silas had gripped it in his final delirium. "Found it in your hand. We had to pry your fingers off it one by one. You held onto that tighter than a man holds onto his last breath." Silas took it, or tried to. His fingers were stiff, and the tips were a haunting, waxy black. He didn't need a surgeon to tell him the price of his journey. He would lose the ends of 3 fingers on his left hand and the toes of his right foot. The winter had demanded its pound of flesh, and it had taken it. But as he sat there, listening to the wind howl against the fort's sturdy walls, he felt a strange, hollow peace. The fear that had driven him for 300 miles, the terror of being forgotten in the dark, had vanished. He had stared into the void, and the void had blinked first. "Bess is gone," Silas whispered, the image of the old mare's eyes in the river rising up to haunt him. "She's a part of the North now, Silas," Thaddeus said softly. "The river takes what it wants, but it didn't take you." In the days that followed, Silas sat by the window of the infirmary, watching the polar dark slowly begin to yield to the first faint ribbons of the returning sun. He was a different man. The resilience of the soul is a heavy thing. It hardens you, like steel tempered in ice. He watched the younger trappers preparing their sleds, their faces full of the arrogance of youth and the belief that they were invincible. He didn't warn them. He knew that some lessons can only be learned when the fire goes out and the wolf begins to follow. One evening he finally managed to snap the rusted latch of the locket. He looked at Martha's face. She looked back at him with the same quiet strength she had possessed in life. Silas realized then that he hadn't walked those miles to get back to a place. He had walked them to remain the man she had loved. He had kept his promise. He had refused to die in the dark. He touched the cold silver to his lips, his scarred hands trembling only slightly. The journey had stripped him of his health, his livelihood, and his youth. But as he watched the first true sunrise in months hit the snowbanks outside, Silas Thorne felt a warmth that no fire could provide. He was a survivor. He was the master of his own ghosts. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a sanctuary. Silas Thorne lived another 12 years. He walked with a limp, and his hands bore the permanent mark of the frost, stiff, gnarled, and missing the tips that the river had claimed as its tax. But those who saw him in his final years didn't see a broken man. They saw a monument. His story is not just a chronicle of a long walk through the dark, it is a testament to the iron thread that binds us to our ancestors. We live in an age of warmth and light, where the turn of a dial banishes the cold, and a flick of a switch erases the night. We have forgotten what it means to listen to the ice. We have forgotten the weight of a silence so heavy it can break a man's mind. But the spirit of Silas Thorne lives in every person who has ever faced a winter of the soul. It is the part of us that when everything is lost, when the horse is gone, the fire is out, and the wolf is at the door, refuses to lie down. The frontier didn't just test Silas's body, it stripped away the noise of the world until only the core remained. It showed him that honor isn't found in victory, but in the refusal to surrender. It taught him that the memories of those we love aren't just weights we carry, but the very fuel that keeps the heart beating when the blood begins to freeze. Our ancestors were not made of different clay than us. They simply lived in a world where the ledger was always open, and the price of life was paid in sweat and resilience. They knew that the polar dark is temporary, but the courage to walk through it is eternal. As the sun finally sets on the story of the man the winter forgot, we are reminded that we are the descendants of survivors. We carry their fire in our veins, and though the world may grow cold and the rivers may break beneath us, we, like Silas, have the strength to take just one more step. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us here at Wildbound History. If you believe the spirit of the frontier still lives, hit the like button and subscribe for our next survival story. Until next time, stay wild.